The frozen January dawn in 2019 shattered with violence on Maple Street. 6 unmarked police vehicles descended like birds of prey on a modest 2-story home in Huntington, West Virginia. Neighbors recoiled behind curtains as officers in full tactical gear surrounded the property with military precision. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski was performing his morning ritual, the same one he'd executed for nearly 5 decades while wearing the mask of a respected high school teacher, community volunteer, and doting grandfather of 4. The thunderous knock at his door exploded through the silence at 7:32 a.m. David Kowalski, West Virginia State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1971 murder of Katherine Fitzgerald. The officers would later describe the chilling moment when the elderly man's hand trembled, not with fear, but with what seemed like relief as he set down his coffee mug. His face remained unnaturally composed, a mask he'd worn for half a century finally cracking as if he'd been anticipating this reckoning since the day he strangled a young woman and walked away into a life built on lies. March 16, 1971. The morning sun cast blood-red shadows across the Marshall University satellite campus in Cabell County. Patricia Wilson, a sophomore studying education, pounded desperately on her friend Catherine's dorm room door, her knuckles raw from the force. "She always met me for breakfast on Tuesdays," Patricia later told detectives, her voice breaking. "When she didn't show up for class either, terror seized me. I knew something was catastrophically wrong." Campus security found 22-year-old Katherine Fitzgerald sprawled across her dorm room floor in a grotesque tableau of death. Strangled with her own scarf, her life choked out of her. Her textbooks lay open on her desk, notes half-written in her careful handwriting, a coffee cup still radiating warmth. No signs of forced entry, no apparent struggle, just a brilliant young life extinguished with brutal efficiency, leaving behind only questions that would torment a community for half a century. For 50 years, the predator who murdered Katherine continued his existence just miles from the crime scene. He attended community fundraisers where her devastated parents spoke through tears about their unspeakable loss. He studied newspaper anniversary stories about the case going cold with the interest of an arsonist returning to watch his fire burn. He observed as Katherine's younger sister became a prosecutor, her entire career driven by the searing injustice of her sister's unsolved murder. The killer coached Little League with a smile that deceived everyone. He served on the school board, making decisions about children's safety. He was named Citizen of the Year in 1997, accepting the award with false humility. He sent Christmas cards to the very detectives who had once interviewed him as a person of interest before clearing his name, a sick joke only he understood. For 5 decades, he hid behind an impenetrable facade of respectability while carrying the darkest secret in Cabell County history. A secret that poisoned every handshake, every conversation, every moment of manufactured normalcy. How did this monster evade justice for half a century? What finally led investigators to tear away his mask after thousands of dead ends? And most disturbing of all, how many lives intersected with a killer who walked freely among them, a wolf in shepherd's clothing hiding in plain sight? Before we expose how this predator was finally dragged into the light and reveal the groundbreaking forensic techniques that shattered this coldest of cases, take a second to click subscribe and hit the notification bell. This channel brings you the most compelling true crime stories with unflinching detail that mainstream coverage sanitizes. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of this extraordinary tale of justice that refused to die. Katherine Ann Fitzgerald was born to Elizabeth and Michael Fitzgerald on June 12, 1948 in Charleston, West Virginia. The oldest of 3 children, Katherine, Kathy to everyone who knew her, was described by family and friends as thoughtful, fiercely determined, and quietly ambitious in a way that made you believe she would change the world. Her father worked as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department, while her mother taught piano lessons from their modest family home on Kanawha Boulevard. From an early age, Katherine displayed a natural aptitude for science that blazed like a beacon. setting her apart from her peers in ways that both inspired and intimidated them. In a time when women were still brutally confined to teaching, nursing, or homemaking, Katherine had her sights set on medicine, a radical dream. Her high school yearbook photo caption reads, "Plans to attend Marshall University and become a doctor." This was no small dream for a working-class girl from West Virginia in the late 1960s. This was a declaration of war against limited expectations. She was brilliant, but never made a show of it, recalled her younger sister, Margaret, in a 2015 interview, her voice still raw with loss decades later. "When I struggled with homework, she'd help me figure it out myself instead of just giving me the answer. That's who she was, always teaching, always believing in people's potential, always seeing the best in everyone." That trust would kill her. Katherine graduated as valedictorian from Charleston High School in 1967 and became the first person in her family to attend college when she enrolled at Marshall University's main campus in Huntington. After 2 successful years, she transferred to the smaller satellite campus in Cabell County to focus on her pre-med studies, seeking the personalized attention that would propel her toward her medical school dreams. By 1971, Katherine was thriving with an intensity that amazed her professors. Her work in organic, chemistry, and biology consistently earned the highest marks. She lived in Sycamore Hall, a women's dormitory that housed approximately 80 female students. Her roommate had withdrawn mid-semester due to family issues, leaving Katherine with a private room, a rare luxury for a college student at that time, and an isolation that would prove fatal. The Marshall Satellite Campus in 1971 was a cluster of 5 red brick buildings nestled against the rolling Appalachian foothills. With just over 120 students, it offered the tight-knit community feel that Katherine preferred over the chaotic main campus. The town of Milton in Cabell County had a population of roughly 3,000, a place where people left doors unlocked and everyone seemed to know everyone else, a place where evil could hide behind a friendly smile. Milton was the kind of place where the worst crime was usually kids tipping over mailboxes on Halloween, said retired Sheriff Jim Holloway, his voice heavy with the weight of shattered innocence. "We had our share of domestic disputes and the occasional bar fight, but violent crime? Murder? That wasn't part of our reality here, until it was." On campus, Katherine had developed a small but fiercely loyal circle of friends. She worked part-time in the university library, attended meetings of the Pre-Medical Society with religious dedication, and volunteered weekly at Cabell County Hospital. Her diary, recovered from her dorm room and now preserved as evidence, revealed a young woman meticulously planning every hour, devoted to her studies, and thoughtfully constructing a future that would be violently stolen from her. March 15, 1971, the day before her murder, began like any other Monday for Katherine, a day of ordinary moments that would become unbearably precious in retrospect. According to statements from classmates and professors, as well as her own diary entry from that morning, she attended her 8:30 a.m. comparative anatomy class, followed by advanced chemistry at 11 a.m. She ate lunch with her friend Patricia Wilson at the campus cafeteria around 1:15 p.m., where they discussed an upcoming biology exam with the casual confidence of young women who believed they had endless tomorrows. "She seemed completely normal," Patricia later told detectives, struggling to control her voice. "We talked about studying together that weekend. She was worried about the enzyme section, but that was just Kathy being Kathy. She always worried even though she'd end up with the highest grade." The normalcy of that conversation would haunt Patricia for the rest of her life. From 2:30 to 5 p.m., Katherine worked her shift at the library. The head librarian, Doris Malone, remembered that Katherine had seemed particularly focused that day, reorganizing the medical reference section with her characteristic precision and helping a professor locate obscure journal articles. It was the last normal afternoon of her life. At 5:30 p.m., security cameras captured Katherine entering the dining hall for dinner, where she ate alone while reviewing her notes, a solitary figure in a moment of peaceful concentration that the grainy footage has immortalized. She checked out 2 books from the library at 7:15 p.m., medical texts she would never read, before returning to her dorm room. At 9:20 p.m., she called her parents, a Monday night ritual confirmed by phone records and her mother's anguished statement. She talked about coming home the following weekend. Elizabeth Fitzgerald recalled in her initial police interview, her voice barely above a whisper, she wanted to celebrate her father's birthday. She sounded happy, excited, making plans for a future that existed only in her mind because someone had already decided she had no future at all. Katherine's final diary entry, written shortly before midnight on March 15th, read, "Tired but accomplished today. Need to finish chem problem set before Wilson's class. Remember to mail Dad's card tomorrow. Summer internship application due Friday. Review once more." The next morning, Katherine would be found dead. Between these ordinary moments of a dedicated student's life and the horror of her murder lay a gap of approximately 9 hours. What happened in Katherine's dorm room between midnight and the discovery of her body at 9:15 a.m. remains the central mystery that haunted investigators for decades. A mystery that would finally be solved through scientific advances Katherine herself might have pioneered had she lived. These details of Katherine's life, her ambitions, her routines, her relationships, her trust, would later become crucial puzzle pieces as investigators attempted to understand not just how she died, but who among them was capable of such monstrous deception. As we continue exploring this remarkable case, I'm curious. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in West Virginia, where this nightmare unfolded, or thousands of miles away, true crime has a way of connecting us all to the fundamental questions of justice and human evil. Let us know in the comments below as we continue uncovering the truth behind one of America's most baffling cold cases. At 9:17 a.m. on March 16, 1971, Campus Security Officer Robert Gaines radioed the Cabot County Sheriff's Department with a code that hadn't been used in the county for over a decade, his voice tight with shock. 1031, possible homicide, Sycamore Hall, room 214. The timestamp of that call marked the official beginning of what would become West Virginia's most enduring murder investigation, a case that would consume careers, destroy faith in justice, and haunt an entire community for half a century. Patricia Wilson's morning had begun with mild annoyance that transformed into concern and ultimately exploded into pure terror. When Katherine failed to meet her for their standing Tuesday breakfast at 7:30 a.m., Patricia initially assumed her friend had overslept. By 8:45 a.m., after Katherine missed their shared biology lecture, something she had never done before, Patricia's worry metastasized into acute dread that convinced her to skip the remainder of class and check on her friend. "I knocked several times," Patricia recalled during her witness statement, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "At first normal, then harder, then I was pounding with both fists. I called out her name. The door was locked, which wasn't unusual, but the silence was wrong. Katherine was always an early riser. The silence felt like death." Patricia sought out the resident advisor, 22-year-old Elaine Summers, who used her master key to open the door after her own knocks went unanswered. What they found would scar them forever. "I'll never forget Patricia's scream," Elaine later testified, tears streaming down her face. "It didn't even sound human. It was the sound of innocence dying. I looked past her shoulder and saw Katherine on the floor between her desk and bed, and I knew. I pulled Patricia back, slammed the door, and ran to call security, my legs barely holding me up." Officer Gaines arrived within minutes and secured the scene, his professional training the only thing preventing him from vomiting. His incident report, terse and clinical, described what he found. Female victim, approximately 20 to 25 years of age, lying supine on floor between desk and bed. Ligature marks visible on neck. No signs of life. Room undisturbed. Door locked. Window closed. The sterile language couldn't hide the horror. Sheriff Thomas Hayward and Detective Frank Mullins arrived at 9:42 a.m., followed 20 minutes later by County Medical Examiner Dr. Howard Levitt. By 10:30 a.m., The small campus was swarming with law enforcement as news of the murder spread through the community like a contagion of fear. The initial scene assessment raised several immediate and deeply disturbing concerns. Detective Mullins wrote in his case notes, with barely controlled fury, "The victim appeared to have been strangled with what we later identified as her own scarf. The killer used her belongings to murder her. There was no sign of forced entry. The room was neat and orderly, except for the area immediately surrounding the body. Most peculiarly, there were 2 coffee cups on the desk, both apparently used recently." This detail, the second coffee cup, would become the most tantalizing and frustrating piece of evidence in the case. It suggested Katherine had willingly admitted her killer into her room, likely someone she knew and trusted enough to share a late-night coffee with. Someone who then used that trust to get close enough to wrap her own scarf around her neck. Dr. Levitt's preliminary examination at the scene established the time of death between 11:30 p.m. Monday night and 2:30 a.m. Tuesday morning. Katherine was dressed in jeans and a Marshall University sweatshirt, not sleepwear, indicating she hadn't been preparing for bed when she was killed. She had let someone in. She had made them coffee. She had trusted them. The ligature marks show consistent pressure application. Dr. Levitt noted in his initial report his clinical detachment masking deep disturbance. The perpetrator approached from behind using considerable force. Death would have occurred within minutes. The victim likely had minimal opportunity to defend herself or call for help. Indeed, the only signs of struggle were defensive bruising on Katherine's forearms and broken fingernails on her right hand where she had clawed desperately at her attacker. The killer had been both swift and powerful, and had walked away without a scratch visible to investigators at the time. As investigators processed the scene with meticulous care, they made several observations that would shape the initial investigation and haunt it for decades. Katherine's wallet remained untouched in her purse with $43 inside, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her class notes were still open on her desk beside the 2 coffee cups, suggesting she might have been studying when her visitor arrived. Her door had been locked from the inside with a key that was later found in her pocket, a detail that confounded and frustrated investigators. Either the killer had their own key, which was highly unlikely given the university's strict key control, or they locked the door from inside and exited through the window, Detective Mullins theorized, his frustration palpable. The window, however, showed no signs of being opened, and the 3-story drop would have been difficult to navigate without injury. The locked room mystery added another layer of nightmare to an already incomprehensible crime. By noon, news of the murder had spread beyond the campus to the wider community like wildfire through dry grass. Local radio stations interrupted regular programming with special bulletins delivered in voices tight with shock. The campus administration hastily called an emergency meeting where they announced the cancellation of all classes for the remainder of the week, their faces pale with horror and liability concerns. The phones in our office rang non-stop, recalled Linda Jenkins, who worked as a secretary in the administration building. Parents were panicking, screaming down phone lines demanding to pick up their children immediately. Students were sobbing in the hallways, clinging to each other. It was like the whole world had suddenly shifted beneath our feet, and we were all falling into darkness. The reaction from the tight-knit Milton community was equally profound and visceral. Local businesses closed early, their owners too shaken to conduct normal business. Churches threw open their doors for impromptu prayer services that overflowed with the desperate and frightened. The town mayor appeared on local television, his hands visibly trembling, urging calm while promising that no resource would be spared in bringing this monster to justice. As investigators continued working the crime scene throughout that Tuesday, they meticulously collected evidence that would eventually, decades later, prove crucial in solving the case. Fingerprints from the coffee cups, fibers from the carpet near the body, microscopic skin samples from beneath Katherine's fingernails where she had scratched her attacker in her final, desperate moments of consciousness. "We're treating everything as potential evidence," Sheriff Hayward told reporters at a hastily arranged press conference that evening, his jaw set with determination. "At this stage, we have more questions than answers. but I want to assure both the campus and the wider community that this case is our absolute priority. We will not rest until Katherine's killer is brought to justice." It was a promise that would take 48 years to keep. By Wednesday morning, March 17th, investigators had begun constructing a timeline of Katherine's final hours, piecing together witness statements, security camera footage, and physical evidence into a narrative of her last night alive. 7:15 p.m. Katherine checks out 2 books from the library. 7:30 to 8:45 p.m. Katherine is seen studying alone in the dormitory common room by several witnesses. 8:50 p.m. Katherine returns to her room according to her hallmate, who briefly spoke with her. 9 to 20 p.m. Katherine calls her parents, confirmed by phone records. 10:15 p.m. Katherine's neighbor across the hall hears what sounds like a kettle whistling in Katherine's room. 11:05 p.m. The same neighbor reports hearing muffled voices from Katherine's room, not arguing, just conversation, just trust being exploited. 11:45 p.m. 2:30 a.m. Estimated time of death based on medical examiner's findings. 9:15 a.m. Body discovered. The investigation's first major challenge emerged when they attempted to identify who might have visited Katherine that night. Her diary contained no mention of expecting company, and none of her friends reported any plans to meet with her. The guest simply appeared, was welcomed, and became a killer. The coffee cups told us someone was there, but nobody would admit to being that someone, Detective Mullins later explained, the frustration still evident in his voice years later. Either the killer was a stranger who somehow gained her trust instantly, which seemed impossible given Katherine's cautious nature, or it was someone she knew well enough to invite in late at night. Someone who wasn't coming forward. Someone who was hiding among us. The second major challenge involved the dormitory security. Sycamore Hall had strict visitor policies requiring guests to sign in at the front desk and leave by 10 p.m. The sign-in log for March 15th showed no visitors for Katherine, and the night guard insisted no unauthorized persons had entered the building after hours. This left investigators with a deeply troubling conclusion. Either the killer was another dormitory resident, a university employee with access privileges, or someone who had found a way to circumvent the building's security measures with practiced ease. The coffee cups yielded the investigation's first substantial leads and first major frustration. Both contained traces of the same instant coffee brand that Katherine kept in her room. But while her fingerprints were clearly visible on one cup, the other had been meticulously wiped clean. An intentional act that screamed premeditation and criminal sophistication. By Friday, March 19th, investigators had interviewed 47 people, including Katherine's friends, professors, dormitory residents, and campus staff. They'd taken fingerprints from 23 potential suspects and collected hair samples from 15. Each person had provided alibis for the night in question, though not all could be immediately verified. The net was cast wide, but the killer slipped through every mesh. The more we dug, the more complicated this got, Sheriff Hayward admitted in his case notes that weekend, his handwriting betraying his exhaustion. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone targeted this young woman specifically. Someone comfortable enough in her presence to share a late-night coffee. Someone methodical enough to clean their fingerprints afterward. And someone who knew how to enter and exit that room without being detected. We're not dealing with an amateur. We're dealing with someone who planned this. As Katherine's body was released to her family for funeral services the following Monday, the investigation hit its first major roadblock. With no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, and a crime scene that raised more questions than answers, detectives found themselves chasing shadows while a killer walked free in the sunlight. The funeral in Charleston drew over 400 mourners, including dozens of classmates who traveled from Cabell County, their young faces aged by trauma. The university president delivered a eulogy praising Katherine's academic promise and personal character, his voice breaking repeatedly. Her father, stoic throughout the service, broke down only when his daughter's casket was lowered into the ground, his anguished sobs echoing across the cemetery. "We demand justice for our daughter," Elizabeth Fitzgerald told reporters afterward, her voice unwavering despite her tear-streaked face and trembling hands. "Someone out there knows what happened to Katherine. We beg you to come forward. We beg you to have a conscience." What neither the grieving family nor the determined investigators could have imagined that day was that justice would take half a century to arrive, or that the key to solving the case was already in their possession, preserved in an evidence box that would sit untouched for decades, waiting for science to catch up to a killer who walked freely among them, shaking hands and smiling, carrying his secret like a poisoned gift he would never unwrap. By April 1971, the initial shock of Katherine Fitzgerald's murder had evolved into something more insidious and pervasive: fear. Enrollment numbers at the satellite campus plummeted as panicked parents withdrew their daughters, no longer trusting the institution to keep them safe. Female students began traveling in groups even during daylight hours, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. The administration installed additional lighting that cast harsh shadows and hired security guards to patrol the grounds 24 hours a day, creating an atmosphere of siege. Meanwhile, the investigation that had begun with such urgent momentum and promise was hitting one devastating dead end after another, each false lead another nail in the coffin of hope. Detective Frank Mullins maintained a methodical approach despite mounting pressure, establishing 3 concentric circles of suspicion around Katherine: those closest to her daily life, those who intersected with her routinely, and those who might have encountered her randomly. This approach yielded an initial suspect list of 27 individuals, 27 people who would have their lives torn apart by investigation, and none of whom would prove to be the killer. "We started with the obvious," Mullins wrote in his case summary, his frustration bleeding through the professional language. Former boyfriends, male classmates who had shown interest in her, faculty members who had close contact with her. Standard procedure that yielded nothing but dead ends. Katherine's most recent boyfriend, Thomas Mitchell, a graduate student at the main Marshall campus in Huntington, became the investigation's first focus and first major disappointment. They had dated for 8 months before breaking up in January 1971. The split had been Katherine's decision, according to her diary entries. She wrote that he became too possessive and couldn't understand her prioritizing med school over marriage. "Classic motive territory," Detective Mullins noted grimly. "Rejected mail, recent breakup, possible obsession. We liked him for it initially." Mitchell was interrogated 3 times during the initial investigation, each session more aggressive than the last. His alibi, that he was studying with classmates in Huntington, 30 miles away, was confirmed by multiple witnesses who remembered his presence that night. Phone records showed he made a call from his dormitory phone at 11:30 p.m., placing him physically within the estimated window of Katherine's murder, but 30 miles from the scene. Reluctantly, investigators ruled him out, though the elimination of such a promising suspect felt like another failure. The second major suspect emerged from witness statements that initially seemed promising. Janet Meadows, who lived down the hall from Katherine, reported seeing a maintenance worker leaving the vicinity of Katherine's room around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, well after normal working hours when no maintenance should have been occurring. "He didn't have any tools with him," Meadows stated, her certainty absolute. "I remember thinking that was odd, but he smiled and said good evening, so I didn't think much more about it. Now, I can't stop thinking about it." This led investigators to Raymond Lewis, a 43-year-old university maintenance employee with access to all dormitory buildings and a minor criminal record. 2 disorderly conduct charges from bar fights in his 20s that suddenly seemed more sinister in context. Initial interviews revealed inconsistencies in his account of that evening, elevating him to prime suspect status for nearly 2 weeks of intensive investigation. The case against Lewis collapsed spectacularly when investigators discovered he had been admitted to Cabell County Hospital at 9:45 p.m. on March 15th with a broken ankle from falling off a ladder, a fall witnessed by 3 other maintenance workers. Hospital records confirmed he remained there until the following morning, physically incapable of committing the murder, his leg in a cast and pumped full of pain medication. "We're not sure who Janet Meadows saw that night," Sheriff Hayward acknowledged in a press briefing, his disappointment palpable. "But it couldn't have been Raymond Lewis. We're back to square one." The third significant early suspect was Professor William Harris, who taught Katherine's advanced chemistry class. Several students reported that Harris had shown special interest in Katherine's academic work, often asking her to stay after class for discussions that seemed to extend beyond normal academic mentorship. One classmate described his behavior as borderline inappropriate, a phrase that sent investigators' radar pinging. Harris voluntarily submitted to questioning and fingerprinting, his cooperation seeming almost too eager. His alibi, that he was home with his wife and teenage children, was corroborated by his family. Furthermore, his fingerprints didn't match any found in Katherine's room, and he had no visible scratches or defensive wounds. Despite lingering suspicions that refused to die, investigators couldn't connect him to the crime scene through any physical evidence. By late April, all 27 individuals on the initial suspect list had been investigated and cleared through alibis, forensic inconsistencies, or lack of physical evidence connecting them to the scene. The investigation had reached its first major impasse, and the pressure from the community was becoming unbearable. "We're dealing with either incredible luck or calculated precision," Detective Mullins confided to Sheriff Hayward in a memo dated April 30, 1971. "This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. Someone planned this meticulously. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing." The investigation then widened to include Katherine's activities beyond campus, casting an even broader net. Detectives interviewed staff at local businesses she frequented, patients she encountered during her hospital volunteer work, and even bus drivers on routes she regularly took. This expanded effort added 43 more names to the suspect list. 43 more people investigated. 43 more dead ends. 43 more ways for a killer to hide. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the crime scene evidence, severely constrained by 1970s technology, yielded minimal results that frustrated everyone involved. The coffee cups had been dusted for fingerprints using primitive powder methods that seemed laughably inadequate even then. The clean cup revealed nothing, not even a smudge. The scarf used to strangle her contained no foreign fibers or hair that could be matched to a suspect with the technology available at the time. Most promisingly, skin samples recovered from beneath Katherine's fingernails indicated she had scratched her attacker with desperate force, likely leaving visible marks. Investigators checked the arms, necks, and faces of every suspect interviewed, searching for telltale scratches. They found nothing. The samples were carefully preserved in the evidence locker, but DNA testing was still years away from becoming an investigative tool, a future that seemed impossibly distant. "Our biggest challenge wasn't just identifying suspects," explained Thomas Hayward in a 1996 interview long after his retirement as sheriff, his voice still heavy with the weight of failure. "It was maintaining the integrity of the evidence we did have while knowing we didn't have the science to make sense of it. All we could do was preserve everything as carefully as possible and hope technology would eventually catch up. It felt like waiting for a miracle." The preservation methods of the 1970s were rudimentary by modern standards, a fact that would later cause anxiety attacks among forensic specialists. Evidence was stored in paper bags rather than plastic containers, increasing the risk of contamination and degradation. Temperature-controlled storage facilities didn't exist in Cabell County, exposing biological samples to heat, cold, and humidity cycles that could destroy DNA. Documentation relied on handwritten chain-of-custody forms that occasionally contained gaps or errors that could compromise evidence in court. Despite these limitations, Detective Mullins insisted on extraordinary care with the Katherine Fitzgerald evidence, elevating it above standard procedure. He personally supervised the packaging and storage of all items, implementing stricter protocols than were standard for the era, treating each piece of evidence like a sacred relic. This foresight, this obsessive dedication, would ultimately prove crucial decades later. By summer 1971, media interest in the case began to wane as attention spans shortened and new tragedies demanded coverage. Local newspapers reduced coverage from front-page stories to occasional updates buried in later sections. Television stations moved on to newer headlines, fresher blood. The fading public attention deeply concerned the investigators, who worried that potential witnesses might forget important details as time passed. Memories dissolving like morning fog. In June, a potentially significant witness came forward with information that briefly rekindled hope. Margaret Simmons, an elderly woman who lived in an apartment with a clear view of Sycamore Hall, claimed to have seen a man climbing out of a window around 1:02 a.m. on the night of the murder. She described him as average height, wearing dark clothing, a description so vague it could have fit thousands of men, but could provide no further details that might identify him. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," she told detectives, her guilt evident. "I thought maybe it was just some boy sneaking out after visiting his girlfriend after curfew. It wasn't until I read about poor Katherine that I wondered if it might be connected. I should have called immediately. I'll never forgive myself." Investigators found Simmons's timeline eerily consistent with the estimated time of death, but her vague description offered little actionable intelligence beyond confirming their window theory. They canvassed the area again with renewed urgency, asking if anyone else had witnessed unusual activity that night, but no corroborating witnesses emerged. The lead evaporated like all the others. By September 1971, 6 months after Katherine's murder, the investigation had effectively stalled, though no one would officially admit it. Detective Mullins and his team had pursued 124 distinct leads, interviewed 201 people, and collected 97 pieces of physical evidence. They had constructed and discarded dozens of theories, followed promising leads that evaporated under scrutiny like mirages, and exhausted every investigative avenue available with 1970s-era techniques. They had failed. Sheriff Hayward faced the grim task of meeting with the Fitzgerald family to deliver the news that their daughter's case was being classified as open but inactive, the bureaucratic euphemism for a cold case, words that landed like body blows. "It was the hardest conversation of my career," Hayward later recalled, his voice still haunted by the memory decades later. "Michael Fitzgerald just stared at me with empty eyes that looked right through me. Elizabeth clutched her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They didn't cry or shout. They just nodded, as if they'd been expecting this moment all along, as if we'd confirmed their worst fears. Their quiet dignity was more devastating than any outburst could have been. I felt like I'd failed them completely." The Fitzgeralds made one request before leaving that meeting, a request that would echo through decades: that all evidence be preserved indefinitely, no matter how insignificant it might seem, because someday, somehow, they believed science would catch up to the monster who'd stolen their daughter. Sheriff Hayward gave his personal guarantee, a promise that would connect 1971 to 2000 through a chain of carefully maintained evidence boxes, each one a time capsule waiting for the future to unlock its secrets. If you're finding this story gripping, hit the like button to help others discover it too. The forensic techniques that eventually solved this case are nothing short of revolutionary, and I'd hate for you to miss what's coming next. What time is it where you're watching? It's fascinating to think that while you're tuning in from different time zones around the world right now, Katherine's killer spent nearly 50 years checking his watch daily, teaching chemistry classes, coaching children's sports, attending church services, perhaps wondering if this would be the day his past finally caught up with him, perhaps hoping it never would. The Fitzgerald family returned to their Charleston home after Katherine's funeral to find it filled with casseroles that would rot uneaten, sympathy cards that offered no comfort, and the suffocating weight of unanswered questions that would press down on them for decades. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, once a vibrant piano teacher with 27 eager students, stopped giving lessons entirely, unable to bear the sound of music in a house where joy had died. Michael Fitzgerald took a 6-month leave of absence from the highway department, returning as a shell of his former self, his eyes perpetually distant as if searching for something he'd lost and could never find. The first year was about survival. Margaret Fitzgerald, Katherine's younger sister, recalled in a 2010 interview, her voice still raw with remembered pain. Mom would set the dinner table for